John Christie stands as one of the most notorious killers in history. The case of the unassuming little man with a terrifying psyche remains debated to this day. It was a morbid tale that horrified the public, but at the same time spurred enormous press attention. A serial killer managed to wriggle free of the law as an innocent man was sent to the gallows for his crimes. In this two-part documentary, we will delve into the world of post-war Britain, where sensational murder stories dominated the headlines. London was home to a terrifying collection of killers. The acid bath murderer John George Haigh was on the loose at the same time as Christie. But as these killers were tracked down and brought to justice, attitudes towards capital punishment were being changed by the troubling case of Timothy Evans and the public outcry to the executions of Derek Bentley and Ruth Ellis. The times were changing indeed. Rillington Place would become one of the most notorious addresses in London's history. In the early 1940s, it was in one of the most run-down areas of the capital, Notting Hill. One of the tenants residing there at that time was John Christie. Christie was born in 1899 in a village near Halifax, West Yorkshire. He was from a large family and had a troubled relationship with his father. It was in adolescence, though, that Christie's sexual problems would develop. His impotence would haunt him for his entire life and may even be the cause of his violent and murderous behavior. His sexual failures soon became public knowledge.
You would meet girls and they'd have a snog and it would go further. He failed to perform several times.
As a young man, he was unable to perform sexually. And the word got round, and so friends taunted him about his lack of sexual prowess. This was a reputation that clung to him for all of his life.
Perhaps eager to conquer his inadequacy with the First World War raging on the continent, Christie enlisted in the 52nd Nottinghamshire and Derby Regiment of the British Army. He was just 17. In the last months of the war, Christie was posted to France. Shortly after he arrived at the front, however, Christie was caught in a gas attack. Mustard gas was used extensively during the First World War. Although initially deployed by the Germans, by the end of the conflict, both sides were using the vicious chemical weapon against each other.
He'd been exposed to an attack of mustard gas, and for about 3 years or so, he could hardly speak. He lost his voice, and this was a problem which did come back to him from time to time.
Christie has said various things, but we don't really know for sure whether that really affected him. And certainly he was operating at a sort of fairly sensible level in various employments he had. So it wasn't anything that would bring him into the category of being anything other than completely responsible for his criminal actions.
Following the end of World War I, Christie married Ethel Simpson in Halifax, but their early years together had been unhappy. Christie moved to London alone in 1924, but almost a decade later, the couple reconciled, and in 1937, they moved into a flat in Notting Hill.
It's a very fashionable part of London now, but then Notting Hill was very seedy and run down.
The house itself, one day to be so infamous, was similarly dilapidated. Christie's prospects were not looking good either, as he had an extensive criminal record at this point. He had served time in prison for theft and violent assault. But when World War II came along in 1939, a new opportunity opened up for him.
During the Second World War, he was a War Reserve constable. So he was given a uniform. He patrolled the streets, calling out people's attention if the light was showing, warning on blackout, and that was his role.
He was somebody who needs to feel a sense of power. So he was very proud of his uniform. He would make sure it was absolutely immaculate. At that time, a special constable during the war in London had a kind of elevated status because people in the community looked to them for help, but he really used that to his advantage.
For perhaps the first time in his life, Christie was in a position of power. It transformed him, and he embarked on an affair with a co-worker. When the woman's husband discovered the illicit romance, he gave Christie a violent beating. Soon after, Christie carried out his first killing.
Ruth Fuest was from Austria, and she'd been a nurse, but she was working in London as a part-time munitions worker.
Ruth Fuest had fled to England after Hitler annexed her homeland in 1938. She was reported missing by her landlady, but in truth her absence was not otherwise much noticed. She was, after all, an unmarried foreigner who had lived at over a dozen addresses in just 4 years. She had no family in London and few friends. Given the war, it is perhaps not surprising that her disappearance was not investigated further. By 1944, Christie was already targeting his next victim. At this time, he was working as a clerk in a radio factory. It was here that he would first meet a new colleague, Muriel Eady. Knowing she was a hypochondriac, Christie preyed on her fears and wormed his way into her confidence. He convinced her that he had the medical knowledge to cure her chest problems.
Hello, love.
Hello, Mr. Christie. It's horrible outside. It goes right through you.
Yes, I've hardly been out all week.
You're feeling better now, though?
Oh, much. Much.
Because we missed you at work.
We can have a nice cup of tea afterwards. And you can tell me all the gossip I've missed. Come on through.
Mrs. Christie not home?
No, Ethel is out. Shopping. Why don't you take a seat there? That's right.
Is this it then?
No, don't.
Sorry.
It's quite all right. It's just a little sensitive, you understand? Now, this will be just the thing for your catarrh. Cleared my bronchitis right up.
It's very kind of you. I get so bad in this weather. I'm coughing all day and night.
Yes, the damp. Not good for the chest. Constricts the bronchial passages, you understand?
You have a word for everything, don't you, Mr. Christie?
That's what my medicine does. Unblocks those passages.
Smells a bit like Friar's balsam.
Are you prying into my secret recipe, Muriel?
Oh, no.
Well, it does share some common ingredients, but Friar's balsam doesn't have the really good stuff that's in mine. Now, are you ready? Just sit yourself back. Close your eyes now, Muriel. Just relax, that's right. Breathe, nice and deeply. You'll soon be able to feel it. That's it, just breathe. Breathe. Lovely.
It's nice, this.
Now, you might start feeling just a touch dizzy, but that's all right. You sat down with me. It's just a sign the medicine's beginning to work.
Mr. Christie.
Shh. Keep breathing. That's it. It's working. Breathe. Breathe.
World War II was coming to a close, the murderous reign of John Christie was just beginning. He would manage to avoid capture for almost a decade, but when new tenants came to stay at 10 Rillington Place, his true nature was in danger of being revealed. John Christie had devised a sinister technique that would enable him to kill without confrontation or violence. That night, he moved the body temporarily into the washhouse at the back of 10 Rillington Place, before finally burying Muriel fully clothed in the garden beside his earlier victim. Unlike Ruth First, though, Muriel was missed. However, amid the flurry of V1 and V2 bombings that year, it was sadly assumed by friends and family that Muriel had been killed in such an attack. There was little investigation. Christie had escaped any suspicion yet again. The end of the war in 1945 should have brought some much-needed respite for the citizens of London, but the truth was, several other serial killers were on the loose, including the acid bath murderer, and a string of horrifying deaths were about to take place. In 1946, the chalk pit murder and the mysterious figure of Thomas Lee grabbed the country's attention. Lee had been a successful politician in Australia whose political opponents had a worrying habit of disappearing or apparently jumping off cliffs. Whilst in the UK, he and an accomplice had been convicted in court of kidnapping, torturing and killing a man and leaving his body in a chalk pit in Surrey. Lee was later declared insane and sent to Broadmoor. At the same time, the gruesome crimes of the lady killer Neville Heath also captured the British public's attention, but John Christie managed to remain undetected. In March 1948, new neighbours moved into 10 Rillington Place, a young couple named Timothy and Beryl Evans, who soon welcomed a baby called Geraldine. They would set in motion a chain of events that would threaten to expose Christie's crimes to the world and send an innocent man to the gallows.
Timothy Evans was born on the 20th of November 1924 in Merthyr Vale in Wales. He had learning difficulties and was prone to tantrums. He often lied about his own life story in order to boost his confidence. That would prove an unfortunate trait when he was eventually accused of murder.
Timothy Evans was, in the terms of that time, simple-minded. He'd had learning problems from a young age. He was working as a van driver in London at the time, and he met Christie and his wife Ethel when him and his wife Beryl went to 10 Rillington Place, Christie's house, because they were looking for somewhere to live, and they went to view a room on the second floor.
The Evans marriage was a strained one. There were constant issues with debt, and it didn't help that both Beryl and Timothy were quite bad with money.
Beryl became pregnant for the second time in the autumn of 1949, but their strained financial situation and their volatile relationship meant that the couple were considering an abortion. However, the procedure in those days was far from straightforward. This was a decision that wouldn't be taken lightly.
In working class districts like this, if pills couldn't be obtained, standard method of abortion would have been a hot bath, a bottle of gin and a knitting needle. Gin was known as mother's ruin for that reason.
Women in that situation were at the mercy of backstreet doctors who were not always trained. And Christie's a prime example. I mean, he knew nothing about how to perform an abortion at all. He basically gassed her, like he did with some of his other victims, to put her to sleep.
Timothy Evans was strongly opposed to the idea from the start, but was persuaded by Beryl and eventually agreed to the procedure. They didn't have to look far to find someone who claimed he could carry out the operation. Initially, it seemed fortuitous that their quiet, unassuming neighbour, claiming to have a medical background, was more than happy to help. But for John Christie, this was an opportunity. Whilst Timothy Evans was at work, Christie prepared his formula, and like with Muriel Eady before her, he used coal gas to render Beryl unconscious.
Tim. Mr. Christie, how did it all go? Sounds quiet enough.
I think it might be best if we spoke upstairs.
What is it?
Why don't you go on up? I'll come behind.
Right. Beryl?
Her stomach. It was septic poison, do you understand? Nothing could be done.
How long? When?
At about 3 o'clock. Another day and she'd have to have gone to hospital.
What did you do?
What you asked me to?
I didn't ask for this.
You asked for my help, Tim. I did say there was a risk. She was septic poisoned.
What does that mean? I have to call a doctor. Someone. I don't know.
That could get me into all sorts of trouble, Tim. Just for trying to help.
Well, I can't just leave her lying there.
It could look black for you.
What?
Well, you and Beryl have been quarrelling a lot recently, and in the street. People will have seen, you understand? Tim, they will think that you disposed of her.
But I never wanted this. I told her, I said, I never wanted this. What am I going to do?
You need to remain calm, Tim.
But I said, and now I have to feed the baby.
Breathe.
What am I going to do, Mr. Christie?
Breathe. Nice and deeply. Now, tomorrow, you just get up and go to work as normal.
What about Geraldine?
I'll see about someone to take care of the baby. Don't you worry about her. You go to work.
I go to work
as normal. Now, we're going to have to move Beryl. I've opened up Mr. Kitchener's flat. We can lay her down there for now. I know just what to do. I was a police officer during the war, and I know about these things, you understand? You need to be strong, Tim, for Beryl's sake and for the baby.
Yes.
Now, let's sort out something for Geraldine to eat, and we can have a cup of tea, yes?
Right. Right.
The murder of Beryl was just the beginning of the tragic tale of Timothy Evans. By exploiting Evans' weaknesses and inflating his own life history, Christie would meticulously take away everything Evans held dear, the outcome of which would see a miscarriage of justice which would have a deep historic impact. Timothy and Beryl Evans, along with their daughter Geraldine, had moved into a flat at 10 Rillington Place. But after becoming pregnant again, Beryl sought an abortion, something their neighbour John Christie was all too happy to carry out. Christie had no knowledge of such a procedure and instead gassed Beryl, physically abused her, and then killed her. Her lifeless body was discovered by Timothy Evans on his return from work. Little is known about the events which unfolded in that house during the days following Beryl's death, but Christie immediately began exploiting Evans' low intelligence. He manipulated him, preyed on his emotions of guilt, panic and anger, and filled his mind with alternate versions of events. Amongst this confusion, Evans fled back home to Wales, alone.
Christie managed to persuade Timothy Evans that he would be better off moving out and carrying on his life on his own and putting his married life and his daughter behind him in his memory.
He goes to Wales to the family, and he gives various excuses as to why Beryl is not with him.
Timothy Evans continued lying about his life. He told some people that his wife and daughter had gone to Bristol, and to some others he said they'd gone to Brighton. On the 21st of November, Timothy Evans returned to London. He claimed it was to inquire after the welfare of his baby daughter, whom he'd left in the care of John Christie. Having received assurances of her welfare, he returned home to Wales. But stricken with guilt, on November the 30th, he went to the police station in Merthyr Tydfil and confessed that he had disposed of his wife. Evans was arrested on suspicion of murder.
He went to the police and told them that his wife had been put down a drain. The police went to the address and they searched the drains and couldn't find anything.
However, a later search led the police to a truly grim discovery. The bodies of Beryl Evans and baby Geraldine Evans were found hidden in the washhouse at the rear of the building. The other two bodies, buried in the garden, remained undiscovered. Beryl Evans and Geraldine had both been strangled. Indeed, the tie used to extinguish little Geraldine's life was still wrapped around her neck. Evans was transported to Notting Hill police station. His first moments there were defining ones. Still reeling from the traumatizing confirmation of his family's deaths, he was questioned at length by detectives. But the statement that emerged was radically different from his earlier accounts. His trial was to begin in just a few weeks.
Is your name Timothy John Evans?
Yes, sir.
How old are you?
25.
Did you strangle your baby daughter Geraldine?
No, sir.
Were you in any way responsible for her death?
No, sir.
When did you first know that she was dead?
When I come to Notting Hill police station and Inspector Jennings told me.
Did you strangle your wife?
No, sir.
Were you in any way responsible for her death?
No, sir.
With respect to your daughter, Geraldine, which is the principal matter we are considering today, have you ever harmed her?
No, sir.
Were you fond of her?
Yes, sir.
In his third confession, made at Notting Hill police station, Timothy Evans had said he alone was responsible for his wife's death, and that he had returned from work on Tuesday the 8th of November, argued with Beryl, hit her, grabbed a rope and then strangled her impulsively. But serious questions have been raised about this third confession.
He felt as if he'd lost his old life and he was in a corner, and he felt immense guilt as well for letting his wife have the abortion, which led to her death. Really, he was led by the police. He had a low IQ. He was very impressionable, and they were able to put him in a corner.
On a personal note, I was a policeman at one time, and I can remember reading for the first time Timothy Evans' statement. And as I read it, I could hear my instructor, how you lay out a statement. And I can remember sitting there thinking, time, date, place, name, age, occupation, address. And as I went through the statement, I thought, the policeman's written this. Evans could never have written this. It's a policeman's statement. That's all stuck with me, that memory of reading for the first time Timothy Evans' statement.
Timothy Evans later changed his account yet again and insisted it was Christie who was responsible for the deaths.
Is it true that one evening, when you came home from work, Christie said he wanted to chat with you about your wife taking tablets?
Yes, sir.
And that he, Christie, knew that she was trying to get rid of the baby?
That's right, sir.
Did he say anything else, Christie, to you?
Well, he turned around and told me that if my wife and myself had gone to him in the first place, he could have done the job without any trouble at all, sir.
What did you say to that?
I told him I wasn't interested.
Where were you speaking? Where were you when this conversation took place?
In his front room, sir.
Did he say anything about his ability to do such a thing?
Well, he mentioned it, that he had done jobs with other young women before, sir.
Did he say whether he had been successful or not?
He said he had been successful.
He said he had been successful?
Yes, sir.
Did he show you anything? Did you ask him anything about his medical knowledge?
He has shown me medical books, sir.
He has shown you a medical book?
Yes, sir.
Can you read?
No, sir.
Can you tell my lord and the jury what was in that book that he showed you?
Well, it had diagrams of men and women's bodies, sir.
Did he say anything about himself with regard to his medical knowledge?
Well, he said that he had been training for a doctor before the war, sir, but had to give it up owing to an accident.
Did he say what sort of accident?
No, sir, and I did not ask him.
Did you ask him how he would bring about an abortion?
I did, but he would not tell me. He just said only him and a doctor would know how to do that sort of thing.
Police, however, remained convinced that they had their man. The hot-tempered, heavy-drinking, inveterate liar of a husband seemed a far likelier killer than the meek and bespectacled inhabitant of the downstairs flat.
The key witness for the prosecution was Evans' apparently upstanding fellow tenant, John Christie. It was his first appearance at the Old Bailey in a capital trial, but it wouldn't be his last.
John Reginald Christie, what is your occupation?
Ledger clerk.
Do you live at 10 Rillington Place, North Kensington?
Yes.
You live in a flat on the ground floor, as shown in our plan. Is the first floor occupied when he is there by Mr. Kitchener? And the floor above, was that occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Evans and their baby girl?
Yes.
You knew them, did you, as neighbours?
Yes.
In the early part of November last year...
The backyard, is that common to all three flats?
Yes.
The other tenants of the flats have use of that backyard?
Yes, sir.
How did they get to it, Mr. Christie?
Down the stairs and through part of the hall to the back door.
Through your front door?
No, through the hall. And there's a back door leading into the yard. They pass our kitchen window, and it's the first turning on the left past there.
How would neighbours get to the backyard without coming through your flat?
They were self-contained flats. We occupied 3 rooms. They would come down the stairs from their own flats.
Well, so that the jury can see. They would come down the stairs in the middle of your flat.
Yes, and turn sharp left.
Turn left at the bottom of the stairs?
Yes, and then turn right and into the yard.
Is that back door kept open or unlocked?
Yes, unlocked.
So the tenants of the other 2 flats could get to the backyard if they wanted?
Yes.
John Christie gave evidence against him that he'd heard bumps and scraping as if bodies were being dragged upstairs.
He was extremely important. He pointed the finger at Tim from day one. Because Christie, being a special constable, was seen as a safe pair of hands, trustworthy.
Nobody then knew the truth about Christie. Nobody knew of the 2 women he had already murdered and the victims yet to come. And nobody in court that cold week in January could have predicted the case before them would become one of the most controversial and debated of the 20th century. The trial of Timothy Evans began at the Old Bailey on Wednesday, the 11th of January 1950. The police were convinced he had murdered his wife Beryl and his daughter Geraldine. Both had been strangled, Beryl with a rope and Geraldine with a striped tie found in place around her neck. Although Evans was tried for the murder of baby Geraldine alone, much of the evidence concerned the death of Beryl. John Christie was the key witness for the prosecution, but he also found himself on the defense. During the trial, he had to explain his own criminal background before the court.
Christie had more than just a dubious past. He'd previously been convicted of theft and beating a woman with a cricket bat. Timothy Evans' defense team hoped to highlight Christie's criminal past and portray him as the real murderer.
You were shown this tie at the police station, is that right?
Yes.
And you were asked if you recognized the tie or something like that? I understand you said no.
No, I did not recognize it.
Did you say anything to the police about the tie to connect it with Evans?
I think I did say that I'd seen Mr. Evans wearing a striped tie, but I could not say whether this was the one or not.
What is the point of telling the police you had seen Evans wearing a striped tie if you could not say if it was that tie or not?
I was asked if I'd noticed what type of tie Mr. Evans used, and I said that I had seen him wearing a red one very frequently, but I had seen him wearing a striped tie. But what the stripe was, I could not recollect.
I see. Did you tell the police that it was not your tie? You're wearing a striped tie now, aren't you?
Yes.
Well, I've got to suggest to you, Mr. Christie, and I do not want there to be any misapprehension about this, that you are responsible for the death of Mrs. Evans and that young baby, or, if that is not so, that you know very much more about those deaths than you have said.
That is a lie.
You are not, are you, a man of good character?
Well, I had some trouble.
On 4 occasions, you have been convicted of offences of dishonesty, have not you?
3.
Then perhaps I had better put them to you. Were you sentenced to 3 and 3 months imprisonment concurrent in 1921 for stealing postal orders? Do you remember that?
Yes, I remember that.
Bound over for false pretenses in 1923. Do you remember that, at Halifax?
Yes, I remember that.
9 months hard labour for stealing material and goods at Uxbridge in 1924.
Yes.
And 3 months imprisonment and various fines with an alternative of prison, again at Uxbridge, for stealing a motor car in 1933. Surely, Mr. Christie, you could remember that? 4 offences of dishonesty.
I had an idea it was 3.
Here we have a sort of a soft-spoken, respectable man who's seen war service. He's been a part-time policeman. He served in the First World War. So despite sort of minor offences, he would seem to be a good witness. And so he is accepted.
I think the main reason Christie was believed was his wife, because she did seem like a good woman. She backed up his story 100%, you know? And the fact that Tim and Beryl had argued a lot vocally, other people had heard the arguments, was easy to go that, you know, to make Tim look like the murderer.
Evans' defense team were unable to land a knockout blow against John Christie, though. The prosecution had little difficulty in painting Evans as the liar he clearly was. Even Evans himself seemed at times to become confused between his different confessions, and he could offer no motive for why Christie would kill his wife or child.
Is it true that on 5 different occasions, at different places and with different persons, you have confessed to the murder of your wife and child?
I have confessed it, but it is not true. I was upset.
Is it right that you have confessed it 5 times at different places and with different people?
Yes, it is.
Are you saying that on each of those occasions you were upset?
The biggest part of them, sir.
I beg your pardon?
Well, for the last one I was.
If you were not upset the other times, then why did you confess to willful murder, unless it was true?
I knew my wife was dead, but I did not know my daughter was dead.
What did that got to do with it?
It has a lot to do with it.
Is that a reason for pleading guilty to murder? Because you're upset because your daughter is dead by some other person's hand?
Yes.
Is it?
Yes.
I see. Let us just look at these occasions. It is you who voluntarily go to the police station on the 30th of November after you have read a letter from your mother to your aunt.
That is right.
It was because in the letter your previous lies had been exposed that you decided to go to the police, was it?
It was not because of the lies.
Why then did you suddenly go to the police?
I was worried about my daughter.
Are you saying that seriously to the jury? That you go to the police and confess to murder because you're worried about the whereabouts of your daughter?
The trial only lasted 3 days. The odds had been stacked against Evans from the very start. His habit of providing false testimony proved critical, and the jury produced their verdict in under an hour.
Timothy John Evans, the jury has found you guilty of willful murder. The sentence of the court upon you is that you be taken from this place to a lawful prison and thence to a place of execution, and that you will be hanged by the neck until dead, and your body buried in the precinct of the prison in which you shall be last confined before execution. And may the Lord have mercy upon your soul.
When the guilty verdict was delivered for Timothy Evans, John Christie burst into tears. Was it relief that he was off the hook? Well, for the time being at least.
A devastated Timothy Evans made an appeal on the 20th of February. It was dismissed. There would be no reprieve for the young man.
Timothy Evans was hanged on the 9th of March, 1950. When Christie's crimes came to light, doubt suddenly fell on the verdict. Was it really conceivable that 2 stranglers lived under the same roof?
What seems more probable by far is that in November 1949, John Christie, already a double murderer, added 2 more to his gruesome tally. The great tragedy of the case was the fact that Christie's first 2 victims were not discovered buried in the back garden when the police found the remains of Beryl and Geraldine Evans. The bodies of Ruth First and Muriel Eady lay buried just a few feet away. In fact, a femur bone was later found propping up a fence.
This miscarriage of justice would cause debate for decades and form a major part of the push to end capital punishment. But on the 9th of March 1950, not only had 1 man been wrongfully executed, the real killer had got away scot-free. His terrible crimes were yet to be discovered, and more were to come.
In Timothy Evans, Christie found an easy scapegoat. Police failings in the prosecution and the fact that the other bodies buried in the garden were somehow undiscovered meant that all suspicions surrounding Christie disappeared. He was now free to find new victims, and the events which followed would shock the nation. The murder of Muriel Eady gave Christie his modus operandi: poisoning, physical and sexual assault, and then strangulation. This sexual violence almost certainly empowered and intoxicated the usually impotent Christie. With the killings of Beryl and Geraldine Evans, 10 Rillington Place was already known as a house of death. But the notoriety of this address would only grow as Christie would find new prey. His next unwitting victim, however, would be very close to home. John Christie had murdered his wife Ethel in the early hours of Sunday the 14th of December 1952. Ethel lay dead for 2 days until Christie finally disposed of her. He wrapped her body in a blanket, prized up the damp and rotting floorboards, and shoved her into the space below. He had plans to explain her sudden disappearance. 2 days before he murdered his wife of 30 years, she'd written a letter to her sister Lily in Sheffield. She asked Christie to post it. Instead, he kept it. With her now dead, Christie put the rest of his plan into action. He changed the date on her letter and posted it off to Sheffield on the 15th.
Now look at the letter, Exhibit 11. When you wrote that letter, you knew your wife was dead and that you had killed her, didn't you?
Well, I must have done.
Well, let me read it to you. First part of it. Ethel has got me to write her cards for her, as her rheumatism in her fingers is not so good.
Yes.
Of course, that was complete invention, wasn't it?
No, not entirely. She had suffered from rheumatism for quite a long time. Her fingers were rather swollen up.
She had not got rheumatism then because she was dead.
Yes, that is quite true.
The doctor says she will be okay in 2 or 3 days.
Yes.
How could you possibly say that?
I don't know. I was just writing down everything that came into my head, I suppose.
Just writing anything that came into your head?
Yes.
I am rubbing them for her. Her fingers?
Yes. Well, I had been doing that for a number of years for her.
Well, that was meant to convey that you were looking after your wife very kindly, wasn't it?
Yes, it seems that way.
As soon as Ethel can write, perhaps by Saturday, she is going to send a letter.
Yes.
That was intended to deceive, wasn't it?
It seems so.
That was to keep the family quiet, wasn't it?
No, that was not a thought. That was never entering my head.
Because you knew you had done something wrong that you did not want to be found out.
No, I disagree.
He covered it up by writing to her relatives and saying that she had terrible rheumatism, she can't visit you, and she can't write to you. And that worked for a while.
You wonder what was going through John Christie's mind at this time, and you can speculate that actually he was on a downhill spiral, and he must have had some guilty feelings about how he had effectively sent Timothy Evans to his death through execution.
Christie may have been carrying around some sense of guilt about the hanging of Timothy Evans and possibly a modicum of sorrow after the murder of his wife, Ethel. These 2 deaths, for which he was solely responsible, enabled him to kill freely, and 3 more women would fall victim to his desires. But Christie wasn't the only serial killer terrorizing London at this time. The capital was also being plagued by the crimes of John George Haigh, the acid bath murderer.
John George Haig was born in 1909. His parents were members of the religious sect, the Plymouth Brethren. And so he had, by most people's standards, a tough upbringing.
His childhood was extremely enclosed and isolated. His father built a big fence around the house. He wasn't allowed much contact. He was a choir boy. He was very controlled.
When he reached 21, he suddenly discovered there was easier ways of making money than working for it. This was when he began getting involved in crooked enterprises with cars and insurance, which would make him money.
He was one of these people who seemed to live in hotels and conduct a life of crime one way or another. I don't think he probably ever paid his hotel bills.
He went to prison for fraud. He showed no violence towards anybody. I think he turned to violence because he was a bit of a megalomaniac and he thought he'd invented the perfect way of killing. He cut out so many risks and not being caught. But what he didn't realise was you have to be careful that you don't kill people that have people who care about them.
He came to notoriety because he was talking to Mrs. Olive Durand Deacon. She was a widow, aged 69. He said he was a businessman and he had this idea for a new kind of artificial lady's fingernail, and she was very interested in that. I think he probably wanted her to put some money into the venture. So he offered to take her down to his business at Crawley so that she could see for herself. Actually, what happened was that he shot her, put her body in a 40-gallon drum of acid.
Haig had already killed 5 people and disposed of their bodies using this method by the time he met Mrs. Olive Durand Deacon. He had murdered a former employer called William McSwan, and then when the parents became concerned about his sudden disappearance, he murdered them too. Having run out of money due to his gambling habit, he then killed another couple and stole their possessions. But the disappearance of Olive Durand Deacon would finally bring his murderous reign to an end.
When Mrs. Durand Deacon was reported missing, the police were called and they interviewed Haig. The police were stunned. Haig said, yes, she did come with me, but you won't find her because I killed her.
They were concerned that they wouldn't find any trace of her. But the pathologist noticed an object which he recognized as a human gallstone. And actually, her false teeth survived, and so did her plastic handbag. Even though he had claimed that he could have disposed of the bodies with a guarantee of success, it wasn't so, and there were still these small items that were left from Mrs. Durand Deacon's remains.
He became a megalomaniac. He realised he was getting away with it, murder after murder, and nobody was arresting him. And this led to him thinking he could do anything he wanted.
John Christie must have had the same sense of invincibility as John George Haig after he'd escaped justice for his crimes and Timothy Evans had been executed.
After Christie murdered his wife Ethel a little before Christmas in 1952, he was free to indulge the darkest side of his character. He concocted all sorts of explanations for his wife's sudden disappearance and began to search for other female victims.
He would never have to leave the down-at-heel area of West London to find them and satisfy his violent sexual urges. He embarked on a murderous path to self-destruction, the outcome of which would shock the nation and uncover one of the most sensational miscarriages of justice of the 20th century. Childhood bullying and sexual repression had manifested themselves in an unassuming killer. 4 women and 1 child had already fallen foul to this monster. More were a certainty.
Christie picked up and murdered 3 women in the first months of 1953. Kathleen Maloney, Rita Nelson, and Hectorina McLennan. He killed them using the same method he'd used to murder Muriel Eady a decade earlier. First of all, rendering them unconscious with carbon monoxide, and then strangling them to death.
Now we turn to Rita Nelson. Do you remember Miss Nelson? Her photograph is an exhibit in the case somewhere.
Yes.
Where did you meet first?
Notting Hill Gate.
Notting Hill Gate. Where?
In a cafe.
Was she alone, or was somebody with her?
She was with a friend, a girlfriend. The two of them together.
The cafe was quite full, and there was not much room, but there was a vacant seat at their table, so I sat with them.
Did you get to talk to her?
Yes. She spoke to me and asked me for a cigarette or a match. I'm not quite certain which. I think it was a cigarette she asked me for. And then she kept the conversation going, and, well, she said they were looking for some different place to stay, to live.
Looking for accommodation?
Accommodation. And so it was then that I suggested that there may be room at my place, that I may be leaving, and they decided to come down. They arranged to come down together later in the evening to see it.
They were both coming?
They were both coming. They arranged to come together.
Did they both come or not?
No, just one.
Once Christie had murdered his wife and left his job, he was able to dedicate his time purely to murder. He would spend a lot of hours in the Rainbow Cafe on the corner of Rillington Place and found that it would be useful for meeting prostitutes and also potential victims.
John Christie must have had some arrangement whereby he invited the women to Rillington Place if they were prostitutes. Presumably this was part of the normal transaction.
Kathleen was a prostitute in the Ladbroke Grove area, very close to Notting Hill. He invited her around for sex, probably paid her and then took the money back, like he always did. And then he gassed her with his tube, strangled her and raped her.
It is all hazy, is it? Had you any reason or malice to hurt that girl?
No, I did not want to hurt her. I've never hurt anybody.
I ought to ask you about Maloney. When she was dead, what did you do with her body?
Well, I just do not know that.
Well, we know it. Millard and the jury, and all of us know it. It was found in the cupboard in the alcove in the kitchen. You know that now, do you not?
Yes, I was told later that it was, but I do not remember it.
How it got there, you do not know. I don't suppose anybody else could have put it there, but you do not remember it.
It must have been me.
Now, Rita Nelson, her body was found in the cupboard. Do you know how that got there?
I do not remember that alcove at all.
You must have put it there if it was found there. No one else could have done that.
It seems certain that I was, but I do not remember anything about that alcove. I know it was there, but I do not recollect it or having used it.
There were other potential victims too, but they were lucky and managed to escape his attentions just in time. But Christie must have known that this was unsustainable.
I think by this time Christie was self-destructive. He'd given up. He was starting to cave in because he did love his wife. We know that for a fact. And he'd been with her for years and years, and she'd done a lot for him, supporting him. So to kill her really was the final nail in the coffin for him. And the way that he left his final 3 victims as well in the house, he knew they would have been found very quickly.
The bodies began to rot and smell. People complained. Unable to work and without his wife's income, Christie was running out of money. He sold Ethel's wedding ring and her jewelry. Most of the furniture in the flat was gone. Finally, he sold the one thing he had left, his tenancy. He sublet the flat to a couple. Discovery was now inevitable. On the 20th of March, 1953, Christie walked out of 10 Rillington Place with a battered suitcase containing his only belongings. He would never return.
The stink is something quite indescribable. And one of the other tenants noticed the appalling smell in the house. They've got to go through the killing ground to the outside toilet.
The tenant was Beresford Brown, who lived on the top floor and had been allowed to use Christie's dilapidated kitchen. When he was cleaning it up, he discovered the source of the foul stench.
The police are called. Ethel is found under the floorboards. They turn over the garden and they find the bodies of the two victims murdered some 10 years before. One of whom, the root of a plant, has actually grown through the vertebrae, and the bones are mixed in with other bones in the garden.
March 1953. John Christie is wandering aimlessly around London. The bodies he's hidden at number 10 Rillington Place have been discovered by the new tenants, and now he's the most wanted man in the country. On the 31st of March 1953, Constable Tom Ledger sees a man in Putney leaning over the railings, staring into the River Thames. He recognizes him as John Christie and immediately arrests him.
Christie was arrested really by chance, early one morning, a foggy morning.
The policeman spots him on Putney Bridge and asks him to take off his hat, and there's the bald dome and the glinting spectacles, and he is arrested.
He had hardly any money left, just a few coins left. It was the end, really. So Christie probably knew he was going to be caught. He probably always wanted to be caught.
What were you doing between the 24th of March and the 31st of March when you were at Putney being arrested?
Well, I just do not recollect, really, what I was doing. I must have been just walking round and round all the time.
You have no recollection at all of what you were doing?
No. I remember one time I was at a crossroad and I think I saw a sign which was strange. It said Barking Road, and then I asked where I was and somebody said I was at East Ham.
Were you deliberately hiding yourself from the police?
No. I was... there was one particular occasion I recall, as though it was yesterday. I was standing, I think, this was after I'd been at East Ham and was on my way back to Kensington. There was a policeman holding the traffic up and beckoned me to go across. I didn't want to go across, but I went across and thanked him as I passed. I went to the other side of the road. I remember that very, very clearly.
Once John Christie was captured, his violent murders would be revealed. When it became clear that he was responsible for the death of Beryl Evans, it was obvious that a huge judicial error had been made and that Timothy Evans could well have been innocent. The same year that Christie stood trial, another innocent man would be sent to the gallows. Both cases would contribute to the abolition of capital punishment. The other unfortunate individual was 19-year-old Derek Bentley. He and his friend, Christopher Craig, who was 3 years his junior, attempted to carry out a burglary which went horribly wrong.
Derek Bentley was born in 1933, and he got very limited intelligence. He was friends with Christopher Craig, who suffered badly from dyslexia, and he enjoyed sort of collecting and using guns and knives and such like.
Bentley and Craig plotted to burgle a warehouse belonging to the Barlow and Parker Confectionery Company in Croydon. Craig armed himself with a modified gun, but the plan was thwarted from the off as they were witnessed gaining access to the property via a drain pipe.
Police were called and they climbed up to the roof of the warehouse by various means.
Bentley was quickly arrested, but Craig tried to escape the police and threatened them with a revolver, saying that he would shoot, and in fact he did start shooting. The police were unarmed, and coming out on the roof, one of the policemen, Constable Miles, was killed.
During Craig's shootout with the police, Derek Bentley had already been captured and arrested and was in custody at the time of the murder, but both would find themselves in court.
The law said that if both were involved in a joint enterprise, and as in this case, one of them used a gun to kill, then both were equally guilty. So on that definition, Bentley was guilty of murder, as was Craig.
You got the situation where the person who fired the shot was spared the death penalty because of his age, and the person who had aided and abetted the murder was executed and thereby got a more serious penalty from the law.
Derek Bentley was executed on the 28th of January 1953, and immediately there was a campaign to secure him a posthumous pardon. It would take 4 decades to procure, but in 1993 his pardon was issued. The case of Derek Bentley highlighted the public unease at the use of the death penalty, and many people began to rally against this irreversible form of justice. What the movement needed, though, was a poster girl, and this would come in the form of Ruth Ellis, the last woman to be hanged in Great Britain. Ellis killed her lover, David Blakely, a hard-drinking racing driver. Their on-off relationship was a particularly violent one.
Ruth Ellis, in 1955, was 28 years old. She was described as a rackety, good-time girl. She ran a club in the West End. Ellis had an affair with David Blakely, and it was a sort of rather tempestuous relationship.
She became obsessed with his movements, became very jealous of what he was doing and whether he was involved in other relationships.
This jealousy eventually got the better of her, and on the 10th of April 1955, Ellis travelled to the Magdala public house in Hampstead with a gun, where she waited for Blakely to leave.
Ellis shot him, brought him down, went up to him and emptied the gun into him as he laid on the ground. She was arrested and taken to a police station and charged with his murder.
There's no doubt that she intended to kill him, so the law was clear.
During those 3 weeks, while public controversy mounted, one man had a terrible decision to make, Home Secretary William Lloyd George. As he went about his public duties, he had to decide whether or not to write the grim words, "The law must take its course." But in the end, he had no choice. As the law stands, and as precedent dictates, Ruth Ellis had to die.
On the 13th of July, 1955, Ruth Ellis was hanged by Albert Pierpoint. There would be no protests or campaigning for the murderous John Christie during the trial at the Old Bailey. Crowds would gather, but not to offer sympathy, only to catch a glimpse of the monster in person. As the word spread of his chilling crimes, 10 Rillington Place, the site where the murders occurred, would also begin to attract crowds. It would not be long before John Christie suffered the full force of the law. But in bringing justice to the victims, grave and fatal flaws would be exposed in both the police force and the British legal system.
On the 31st of March 1953, Police Constable Thomas Ledger arrested the most wanted man in the country. The corpses of 4 women had already been discovered in his house. 2 more victims from far earlier were soon to be found buried in his garden.
Whilst in custody, he began revealing the details of his morbid life story.
Once he was in custody, he was quite quick about confessing. He confessed to 7 murders, but never admitted to the murder of the baby, Geraldine. He would never admit to that. But we are 99.9% sure that he did murder the baby as well.
There are opposing views as to why Christie confessed to murder. Was it an attempt to prove his madness and thus aid his plea of insanity? Nothing is ever clear in the case of John Christie.
In an attempt to save John Christie from the noose, his defense team at the trial would argue that Christie was indeed insane. The man defending him was Derek Curtis Bennett. He was a well-known defense barrister. For Curtis Bennett, insanity was the only plausible strategy for excusing the sick and violent crimes Christie had committed. The prosecutor, Sir Lionel Heald, however, didn't have to try too hard to convince the jury of Christie's guilt. All the evidence was stacked against him. It took just 85 minutes for them to decide the verdict.
I think Christie probably had personality disorders rather than being insane.
Prisoner at the bar, you stand convicted of murder. Have you anything to say before judgment of death is passed according to law?
John Reginald Halliday Christie, you have been found guilty of murder by the jury, and for that crime there is only one sentence known to our law. That you be taken from this place to a lawful prison, and thence to a place of execution, and that there you be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and your body buried in the precincts of the prison in which you shall be last confined before execution. And may the Lord have mercy upon your soul.
John Christie was executed on the 15th of July, 1953 by Albert Pierpoint, the same executioner who'd sent Timothy Evans to his death 3 years earlier.
I think the fact that Timothy Evans had been executed, and it might well have been a miscarriage of justice which could not be corrected, did have an effect on the debate about capital punishment in this country.
It helped lead to the suspension of capital punishment, and the 50s was a terrible time for miscarriages.
Along with the executions of Ruth Ellis and Derek Bentley, the hanging of Timothy Evans played a huge role in the abolition of capital punishment in the UK in 1965. All 3 murder trials and their accompanying death sentences provoked massive public reaction and were seen as terrible miscarriages of justice, both at the time and today.
I think the whole history of how capital punishment came to be abolished is quite an interesting one. You have some cases where there's clearly an anomaly and some injustice, and you would say Timothy Evans was a miscarriage of justice, and if you have a death penalty, then you can't correct it afterwards.
Timothy Evans eventually received a posthumous pardon. But the controversy around what happened to him changed the country forever.
This pardon would be issued in 1966, 16 years after Evans' execution, even though, just before his own execution, John Christie had actually confessed to the murder of Timothy's wife, Beryl. It's thought he was responsible for 8 deaths in total. But Christie had been a member of the Wartime Reserve Police in World War II. He would have had many opportunities in that position to carry out murders and cover them up. So, we can never be sure.
After John Christie's death, the area where he committed his crimes, Notting Hill, became one of the most fashionable and desirable in the city. It just goes to show that while London might have been home to some of history's most wicked individuals, she always bounces back. As we've seen in this series, the murder maps of London may be dotted with sites where the most horrendous crimes took place. It hasn't stopped her remaining one of the world's great cities.